There's a moment in every war when the official story no longer makes sense, a moment when the speeches, flags, and patriotic slogans stop matching what's actually happening on the ground. You can feel it, a strange gap between what leaders say and what soldiers see, a gap between the narrative and reality. And if you look closely at history, not the version polished for classrooms, but the messy version buried in old shipping logs, tax records, corporate letters, and forgotten treaties, you start to notice something uncomfortable. Wars don't ignite because people suddenly hate each other. They don't erupt because two sides woke up one morning with irreconcilable ideologies. Wars start the same way markets crash, empires collapse, and civilizations turn desperate. They start with shortages. Shortages of money, shortages of resources, shortages of control. And every time people run out of something they believe they're entitled to, somewhere on the map, a nation quietly begins preparing for war. Long before the public ever hears the first speech. Hey, I'm Mike. Welcome to the channel where we uncover the hidden forces shaping history, power, and money. Every video here reveals something most people never notice. So if you enjoy seeing the world through a different lens, tap that like button. It helps more than you think. Now, let's pull back the curtain and talk about something governments never admit out loud. The real reasons countries go to war. It always begins with a performance. A polished official standing in front of cameras, reading a script crafted by dozens of advisors. They talk about defending freedom, protecting human rights, or preserving national honor. They paint the enemy as evil, irrational, barbaric. This speech repeats through every century, every culture, every conflict, like a ritual. But behind the words is something entirely different. Wars begin when someone's wealth is threatened, when a powerful interest group stands to lose money, resources, or influence. The people who eventually march into battle, the soldiers, the workers, the civilians, rarely understand what's truly at stake. They're told stories about heroism, duty, and patriotic sacrifice. But the real motivations are hidden in ledgers, trade disputes, corporate memos, and underground negotiations that most of the world will never see. Let's look at one of the most disturbing examples. There was a time in history when a simple flower, a plant that had been transported, traded, taxed, and used for centuries suddenly became illegal. Not because it was dangerous, not because it harmed society, but because one global empire couldn't control the profits anymore. Their solution wasn't diplomacy, it wasn't negotiation, it wasn't compromise, it was war. Gunboats were dispatched, cities were shelled, entire coastal regions were forced open by naval bombardments. And all of it, every casualty, every treaty, every humiliation, stemmed from a conflict over profit margins. Not morality, not justice, not national pride. It was about who gets to make money, and who doesn't. And if you think that was a one-time event, think again. The same pattern repeated itself almost perfectly decades later in Central America. A fruit company, yes, a fruit company did not like a newly elected president, not because he was corrupt, or violent, or authoritarian, but because he wanted to tax them. He wanted the people of his country to receive a fair share of the wealth extracted from their own land. Within months, a military coup materialized out of thin air. Suddenly, propaganda filled newspapers around the world. Suddenly, a democratically elected government was labeled dangerous. Suddenly, foreign soldiers appeared, and overnight, a nation's future flipped not because of ideology, but because a handful of powerful businessmen wanted to protect their profits. Millions were told this was about preserving democracy, but behind closed doors, it was simply about keeping bananas cheap and taxes low. Patterns like this are everywhere. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. Whenever a nation's economy relies too heavily on a single resource, whether it's silver, sugar, cotton, oil, bananas, or microchips, that resource becomes a trigger waiting to be pulled. If the revenue stops, if prices collapse, if trade routes are threatened, the pressure builds until something snaps. And this is where modern conflicts become even darker. Because the biggest wars of the last century were not accidents of history. They were not misunderstandings between nations. They were strategic calculations based on supply, demand, and control. Take oil, for example. When oil became the lifeblood of global industry, powering factories, vehicles, armies, and entire economies, the Middle East instantly transformed into the most strategically important region on the planet. Not because world leaders suddenly cared about the people living there, but because the world's superpowers had developed an energy dependency. Pipelines replaced battlefields, oil terminals replaced fortresses, and borders were redrawn with rulers instead of respect for culture or geography. The moment a country in the Middle East tried to nationalize its oil, conflict followed. The moment a leader tried to redirect profits to his own nation instead of foreign corporations, he was quietly removed or loudly invaded. And every time, the world pretended it was about freedom. But oil is only one chapter in a much bigger story, because the next life or death resource isn't something you can dig out of the ground. It's something that flows, and without it, no country can survive. Water, rivers are shrinking. Lakes are evaporating. Aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are collapsing in a matter of decades. Entire regions are drying out faster than governments can react. And for the first time in centuries, nations that never worried about water security are starting to panic. What happens when two countries share a river and one of them decides it needs more? What happens when farmers can't irrigate their fields? What happens when a major city's taps run dry? History tells us exactly what happens. Negotiations begin, tension rises, and eventually, someone chooses force. Because you can survive without oil. You can survive without gold, but you cannot survive without water. But here's the twist. The biggest wars of this century might not even be fought over physical resources at all. They might be fought over something invisible, microscopic, and yet more valuable than steel, oil, and gold combined. Microchips. These tiny pieces of silicon decide who leads the world. They run military systems, satellites, missile defense networks, banking systems, energy grids, communication networks, artificial intelligence, and even the phones in people's pockets. Without chips, modern society collapses. Right now, 90% of the world's most advanced chips come from a single island. An island claimed by one superpower and protected by another. One sees it as a rebellious territory. The other sees it as the backbone of its technological dominance. Both see it as something they cannot afford to lose. That is why ships are quietly repositioning. Why aircraft fly closer and closer to restricted airspace. Why diplomats speak in increasingly careful language. Why intelligence agencies are on high alert. This conflict will not be about ideology. It will be about supply chains, industrial capacity, and economic survival. If you look at history with clear eyes, you'll notice something disturbing. Every generation is told that their war is different, that their conflict is the good one, the moral one, the justified one. But underneath all the speeches and slogans lies the same ruthless truth. Wars begin when money stops flowing, when a resource becomes scarce, when a powerful group feels its control slipping. The real story of every war is written long before the first shot is fired. It's written in trade routes, corporate interests, economic pressures, and the cold calculations of people who never step onto the battlefield. And when you understand that, the world suddenly makes a lot more sense, and becomes a lot more terrifying. If you're enjoying this deeper look into the hidden forces shaping our world, make sure you like this video, share it, and subscribe so you never miss the stories others don't tell. Because the next conflict won't begin with an explosion. It'll begin with a shortage of something essential, something valuable, something a nation believes it has the right to control, and most people won't notice until it's too late. Thanks for watching. The next video goes even deeper into how the Roman Empire completely collapsed, and trust me, you don't want to miss that.